through medical oncology, radiation, and radiology services, focusing on emotional, physical, and social support. Outsmarting cancer, one patient at a time.
I'm Katie Beery. Thanks for joining us. Today, the Cronkite School awards the 33rd Annual Cronkite Award for Excellence in Journalism to Scott Pelley, the CBS Evening News anchor and managing editor. As we reflect on Mr. Pelley's contributions to the world of journalism, we also continue to commemorate Walter Cronkite, who would have turned 100 years old this year. Tonight, we take you to a special conversation at the museum in Washington, D.C., in which some of the leading journalists in the country, including the late PBS NewsHour anchor and managing editor Gwen Ifill, discussed Cronkite's legacy and the future of the news industry.
Bob, let me begin with you. What distinguished Walter Cronkite as a news anchor in his time, and what was his influence on news anchors to follow and American television in general?
You know, Walter loved the news, and he loved anybody that loved the news or cared about the news. When Arnold Palmer died earlier this week, it reminded me so much of Walter because he and Walter were so much alike. I never, ever saw Walter Cronkite be rude to anyone who walked up to him. I mean, people would walk up to him on the street, and I don't care where he was or what he was doing, and he'd stop. He would pass the time of day with them, and before it was over, he was asking them questions. And people, I think Walter was so interested. He's the most curious person. He had a curiosity, and that's what made him a great editor. I told a story last night at dinner. I mean, it'd be 6:20, the evening news would be going on, and Walter would look up and say, "How long is Greenland?" Well, who the hell knows how long Greenland is? Who cares how long Greenland is? But Walter wanted to know, and we called them WWs, Walter Wants, and we stopped until we found out how long Greenland was. And he would come up with these questions. I'll never forget one time at the White House, he'd call us around, and Walter was exactly on television. I mean, he was exactly in person the way he was in television, even that very unusual way he talked. And he was always asking questions. He called me for once in my life. I knew the answer to this question. He said, "Well, thank you, Bob. This old gray head just had a question mark above it." I mean, he really talked like that. I loved him.
Gwen, you're the only one of the four who didn't work at CBS News, but you've been an anchor now for 17 years.
CBS would not have me, yeah.
So what influence has he had on how you perform as an anchor and what you see as your responsibilities and the values that you try to adhere to?
Imagine my shock and surprise and pleasure with the first time I met Walter Cronkite, to have him actually with acknowledge that he watched me on the news every night, and which of course scared the hell out of me, because all of a sudden you realized it was a standard that you were trying to meet. But here's the thing. So many of us in our business are attempting to achieve that level of trust. And what we know to be true about our business right now, television and newspapers and radio and blogs and all the things we are, is that we're not there anymore. That nobody looks at any one of us and says, whatever that comes out of your mouth, that I trust. But the best of us are striving for that every single night. And we're striving for it with Walter Cronkite's face in our heads, with the idea, not that we're ever going to be at the place where if we say it, you believe it instantly, but the fact that if we say it, it's because it's backed up, because it's reported. It's not just my opinion. It's not just my bright, clever witticism. We are asking questions for a reason. It's not because of the personalities asking the questions. It's because of the answers that they elicit. And whenever we get caught up talking about what the questions are, we forget that the reason why Walter Cronkite turned conversations with him on the street into interviews is because that was his way of reporting. That was his way of getting to know more. And if people came to him and approached him and said, I know you from the Dinosaur Show, that was his opportunity to talk to someone who he otherwise would not have met. It's the opportunity we all kind of have to take, especially those of us who are at the wonderful chain to the anchor desk and get out a lot less often to talk to folks than we otherwise would. The salvation for the news business, I've had the beauty of being on this stage many times to talk about different news moments in our history. And the salvation for the news business is that we try to be more like that and not less like that. There's, as you know, an entire swath of the news business which doesn't understand what that means, which doesn't understand that telling a story and who tells the story and what voices you hear and the kinds of voices you hear is as important as what comes out of the anchor's mouth or comes out of the reporter's mouth. And my goal, you know, I'm involved with a group called the News Literacy Project, which is going into high schools and trying to tell people, train young people on what to hear, what to believe. And I think that that's our goal for the next generation, not only of journalists, but also of news consumers who are getting their information from so many places. And I think Walter would be proud of that approach to how we cover the news.
Scott, you were a young CBS correspondent after Walter left the anchor desk, but you've said in Douglas Brinkley's biography of him that he had a tremendous impact on you nevertheless, that he was a mentor to you. Can you tell us what that was like and how it's influenced what you're doing today?
I sought out, I had been an enormous fan of CBS, you know, growing up really in the 60s, watching television news, watching Walter Cronkite anchor the evening news through the tremendous incredible period of time that he was working. The times were so much a part of the Walter Cronkite we know. I mean, think about this period that he covered, the assassination of the president, Martin Luther King, Robert Kennedy, the Civil Rights Movement, Vietnam, Man on the Moon, Watergate. I mean, it's an astounding period of time in American history, and Walter was the guy. Walter was the man throughout that entire period of time.
President Ford went up to New York, and they made some reason for going, but really the reason he went up there was to be interviewed by Barbara Walters, who was the host of the Today Show at that time, and I must say the strongest competitor I ever competed against. She was really, really something. So anyway, she did the interview at mid-morning after the Today Show and then put out the word that if anyone interviewed the president before that interview ran the next morning on the Today Show, they would be killed.
I can hear that.
Barbara had a way of making people believe that might really happen. So being reporters, we all set about, it became our objective to bust Barbara's scoop. And so I went to the press secretary and said, do you think I might? No, we've told Barbara we're not gonna do that. No interviews. So I said, do you think that might be possible to interview the president? And he said, no, Bob, we've given our word to Barbara Walters. And I said, yeah, but I said, you know, Walter Cronkite, he wants to come out and join us up at Yonkers. They were going up there. And I said, he wants to, you think it might be possible to get Walter in to he said, Bob, we just can't do this. And I said, well, let me ask you this. I said, could I just get Walter in to say hello? I said, I know the president likes him. And he said, well, yeah, we could do that. And he said, and I said, do you think it would be all right if we brought a camera crew in? I said, you know, just so Walter could have a souvenir. And he said, Bob, we're not going to do any interviews. And I said, but what about he said, okay, I'll let him come in. And so anyway, we go to the back door of where the president was about to appear. And the cameraman was here. And Walter was here, and Walter took the microphone in his left hand. They led us in there. He walked straight up to Gerald Ford and said, Mr. President, are you going to take your flu shot? Well, President Ford he almost broke out into a horse laugh because he knew what Walter was doing, and he liked Walter, and he said, yes, Walter, he said, I think the president needs to set an example. I'm going to take the flu shot. Well, the evening news that night started exactly this way. Good evening. President Ford told me in an exclusive interview on the campaign trail tonight.
The truth is, he was all the things we've been saying. He was our moral, it's kind of corny, but he was our moral beacon. He really, really was. He loved the news in the purest way, because we had standards. I remember him always saying, we don't, go with what the wind is telling us to do. In other words, we don't hear from the public, what do you want to hear? Do you want to hear some, tabloid story? No, we tell, but we make the judgment about what hard news is. And he stood by that the whole time he was anchor man.
You
And
know,
we wanted, just one more point.
Oh, go ahead.
We lived to
Go ahead,
make
Robert.
him happy as reporters who worked for him. We lived to have Walter say good piece, right?
Absolutely.
Okay, here you go.
That was the greatest compliment that you could get when but Walter was very good about when you had a good story. He knew what a good story was, and he called and told you. And it wasn't, he didn't call every night or anything like that. But, when you'd worked on something really hard, the thing was that Walter had not spent his whole life in the studio, under the studio lights. He'd been a reporter. He covered the news. He knew it's not always easy to get that one little detail that you need to know that the story is correct. And so a compliment from Walter was just about as good as it could possibly get. But the thing about Walter that I think the reason people loved him so much and trusted him so much, he never tried to come off as someone who knew more about something than the people he was reporting for. He left the impression that he was just as interested in the news as the people who had turned it on that night, and that he had done his homework and that he was prepared. And I mean, he would study. I mean, when he would do those long stints during the space program and those long times he would be on television, he has spent hours doing his homework and doing what anyone would do or should do, and too often does not do. But I think it came across. It what? Leslie said, what am I talking about, doing your homework? It's kind of a novel concept sometimes today. But Walter did his work, and it was reflected in what when he reported those stories. And when the boss sets certain standards, I firmly believe that what the boss does, the guy at the top of the heap does, is set the example for the rest of the troops. It's not giving people a bunch of orders and all of that. You watch how he does his work, and you figure out, wait a minute, that's how you're supposed to do it. And to me, that's what I always loved about Walter. I mean, he just loved being a reporter, and it just came through in every single thing that he did.
Leslie, he was also a shaper of the news at a time when there were relatively few gatekeepers, only 3 networks, and only a few national newspapers with national impact. You worked on an important national story as a young reporter in Watergate when Bob and Carl were working on it at the Post. And there was that period when we felt all alone at the Post. I was one of the editors working on Watergate. And the Nixon administration was against us. Many of our peers in the news media were against us. And most of America didn't know anything about Watergate. And Walter wanted to do something about that. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, and it was in the midst of the 1972 election campaign, don't forget.
Yes.
Nixon's re-election campaign. And Walter decided that he was going to devote an enormous chunk of the evening news to tell the Watergate story.
At first it was called the Watergate Caper. 5 men, apparently caught in the act of burglarizing and bugging Democratic headquarters in Washington.
Basically, as Woodward and Bernstein had reported it, because there wasn't, as you said, very much other reporting. So he designed, Walter himself, 2 pieces that were going to run 2 consecutive nights, each about 14, 15 minutes long. And it was explosive. He did the first one, and Bob Woodward and I were friends back then. He called and he was, genuflecting, thank you, tell Walter, thank you. Because it gave them an imprimatur. But it was an explosive thing for Walter to have done. It was so huge that Bill Paley, who was the head of CBS, came in and said, you're not going to do that on the second night. And Walter said, oh, yes, I am. But the second night ran, but it was only 7 minutes. But nevertheless, our audience in those days was enormous. Walter, first of all, the whole country was divided in 3 parts, those who watched NBC, those who watched CBS, and those who watched ABC, and there was nothing else to watch at 6:30, so everybody watched. That's how everybody got their evening news. And Walter was the most popular. We had the highest ratings, so a gigantic number of people watched this. And it was their first education about what was happening with Watergate. This was before the hearings.
I have never cheered in the newsroom, and I cheered that night at the TV set, and it made an enormous difference because then the rest of the media got onto the story. Cy Hirsch went to the New York Times, and I never was so grateful for competition.
Well, you can't imagine.
It really made it a national story.
It did. It did.
It was your
It did.
reporting.
And it made it acceptable for the rest of the media to get involved.
But Bob, were you in the newsroom that night? I remember everybody standing, as your newsroom.
Yeah.
We stood up, we had monitors of all the 3 networks, and we stood up and we applauded Walter for the courage of what he was doing.
Right.
Which is an important point to mention, is that there's a lot of, those were the good old days and part of our conversation here, but it could not happen like that again. It could not happen. There are not 3 networks which everyone is getting their news from. There are a zillion ways to get your information, including on your phone, including on your watch. And so we can't shape the entire, there are people doing amazing work right now in newspapers about Donald Trump's finances, and it has a little bit of effect, but not the huge effect it would have had if there were only a few sources. So it's nice to think about the good old days, but it's also important to remember it's not quite duplicatable.
Walter then followed up later on by going to Vietnam.
And now, 3 weeks after the offensive began, the firing still goes on from here.
To do his own on-the-ground reporting at a time when the country was divided over what was happening in the war. The administration said it was going well. Reporters on the ground said it wasn't. He went, he decided it wasn't, and the audience saw his brief excerpt from that report. So that's twice in which he essentially, I don't know if he would say expressed a point of view, but he certainly steered the news in a certain direction.
It was a point of view.
Yeah, it was a point of view.
We pretend he was just straight down the middle telling you the world as it was,
so
but that was a decision.
Right.
Well,
so I wanted to ask Scott, how far do you think you could go?
It was labeled that way at the time. I'm sorry, Lynn?
I was going to say, how far do you think you can go in something like that? For instance, right now, there's this whole question over whether or not Trump gets an easier ride from the media and lies need to be called lies. How do you feel about your role as a reporting anchor on that?
Well, the documentary that you're talking about, the half-hour documentary, was right after the Tet Offensive in 1968.
Correct. And he was there.
And Walter did his interviews and did his field work, and then at the end, there was the famous commentary, and it was labeled at the time commentary. There was a lot of discussion between Walter and the then president of CBS News, Dick Salant, about whether to do that, how to do that, and how to label it, if you will, for the audience. So they decided that they would do it and that they would label the end of that documentary commentary. I don't believe Walter ever did anything like that before, and I'm not sure he did much of anything like that since then. We remember it very well because of how prescient it was.
Right.
It turned out to be exactly right, a prediction of what would happen about 6 years later. So it was discussed between Walter and Salant, and it was an important decision that was made, that they were going to step out and do this. Of course, Bill Moyers, who was deputy press secretary in the Johnson administration, claims that he heard President Johnson say, if I've lost Walter Cronkite, then I've lost middle America.
It wasn't long after that he announced he wasn't going to run again.
It was about 5 weeks after that he announced that he wasn't going to run again. So your question is, can I do that? I just don't believe opinion belongs in what I'm doing.
Well, I was just going to say that's the problem now. It's very murky for people. The question I get more often, especially on college campuses than any other, is how do you keep your opinion out of your question?
I was going to ask you that.
How do you not frown when someone is lying to you? How do you behave when someone who is clearly distasteful is speaking to you? And I say I don't have any problem with it because I want to hear the answer. And they're stunned at this because young people especially have been brought up in an era in which they've been force-fed people's opinions. And so we don't make clear enough the distinction that Walter drew, the line that he drew between his reported opinion and his opinion.
Hello, I'm Walter Cronkite. You know, every hour of every day, important headlines are being made all over the world. Good evening from our CBS newsroom in New York on this, the first broadcast of network television's first daily half-hour news program. What scripts have we got in so far, Benton?
Douglas Brinkley's biography, you talked about how impressed you were with the way that Cronkite handled the breaking news of former President Lyndon Johnson's death right in the middle of the evening news being on the air, which must be very challenging for an anchor. Can you describe why that, you were a relatively young person at that time. Can you tell me why that impressed you so much?
Well, I didn't see it when I was 11.
Okay.
Which was my first year at CBS News. But I've seen it many times since then.
Yes.
And I don't know if you saw it in the film about Walter, but what happens, 1973, no one knows this yet, only Walter Cronkite knows this, but Lyndon Johnson has died en route to the hospital in San Antonio after suffering a heart attack at his ranch. The evening news is on the air. There's a story about Vietnam on, and suddenly they cut out of the middle of the story, and Walter is on the phone. And I don't know, can you hear me all right this way?
I'll hold it.
All right, because I got to use my hands. Walter is on the phone on live television, and he looks up at the audience and he goes,
Can you imagine?
And he goes, all right, Tom, okay. All right, Tom, I got it. Puts the phone down and he says, I'm just talking to Tom Johnson, who is the press spokesman for the former president, and Lyndon Johnson died today en route to the hospital, et cetera, et cetera. Here's what I love about that. Walter didn't care anything about all the window dressing and everything has to be perfect on television and the formats calling for this story and that story. It was the news, and that's all he cared about. And if he had to be on the phone and tell the audience, hold on just a second.
I'm going to try that.
I'm going to be right with you. And that's what we like to do at CBS. In fact, I did it to poor Bob Schieffer just the other night. We were at the debate, and Bob was speaking, and we were talking about our impressions of the debate, and Governor Pence walks into our workspace. Didn't know he was coming. There he is, standing right there. And Steve Kappas, the executive producer, said, Mike Pence is in there, get him on the air. And I thought, well, you know, how should we go about this? And Kappas said, it doesn't matter, just get him. And so I just said, you know what? I'm talking to the audience, and this is what reminded me of Walter. I said, Mike Pence has just walked in here. Governor, why don't you come right over here and join us? And I had to lean over to Bob Schieffer, my hero, and I took his microphone his lapel and gave it to the governor of Indiana. And so...
Which is the equivalent of doing this.
It's the equivalent of doing this, exactly right. I don't know how it looked on the air, but that's the important thing. It doesn't matter. It was news.
Right.
And that's what I love about that moment with Walter.
Right.
And next week, I'm going to bring my own microphone.
That'll teach you.
Now, Bob, similarly, more seriously, was that amazing time on the air when he had to announce the death of John F. Kennedy.
There has been an attempt, as perhaps you know now, on the life of President Kennedy. He was wounded in an automobile driving from Dallas Airport into downtown Dallas, along with Governor Connolly of Texas. They've been taken to Parkland Hospital there, where their condition is as yet unknown. From Dallas, Texas, the flash, apparently official, President Kennedy died at 1 p.m. Central Standard Time, 2 o'clock Eastern Standard Time, some 38 minutes ago.
What do you think the impact of that was? The way in which he showed evident emotion, the way in which he was on the air checking reports, telling you that he was still checking out reports before he made the final announcement. Again, it was seeing him behave like a newsman in person.
Well, again, it was Walter. People understood that Walter cared. And, I mean, how could you not be moved? And he didn't do anything fancy or, again, talking like... He was checking the stuff, and when they finally handed him the note that said, the president is dead, he kind of blinked his eyes, and we all remember that moment, you know, and that we would never forget. But again, this was Walter Cronkite being a reporter. This was Walter Cronkite waiting until he had the facts exactly, and he was certain of it, before he broadcast it.
I think the reason that this country is the country in the world that's the least corrupt is because we have had a strong press and a strong investigative arm of the press. And it's really, I'm tooting our own horn, but it is so important to the country.
I would be despairing of my craft, of my profession, if I didn't think there was another generation that was coming along to do it the right way and to learn and to teach me things, frankly, that Snapchat I don't get yet. But I want to, well, I don't really want to know, but there are some... But I do want the people who use these different platforms to tell the stories, to tell the arc, to tell it right. I do want them to have the basics of journalism, which drive them. I don't want them to forget who Walter Cronkite was and why he was. To heck with us, we want to be able to step away from this and make sure it's still genuine and real. And for that reason, you know, we come here. For that reason, we go to college campuses. For that reason, we want to raise another generation of people who know that there's a way to tell the story.
Support for Arizona PBS comes from viewers like you and from...
Lights of the World International Light Festival is coming to Phoenix. Life-size dinosaur exhibit, daily acrobatic shows, and over 25 acres of light displays. November 18th through January 29th at Rawhide Wild Horse Pass. Information at lighttotheworldus.com.
Today's program is sponsored by RADW CPA's Business and Financial Advisors, serving the needs of businesses and individuals since 1953.
Retire like you mean it. Meritage Active Adult Communities.
Explore new ideas and new worlds here on Arizona PBS, a community service of Arizona State University.
Antiques Roadshow is on a quest to find the treasures of the Empire State.
It is Tiffany. Oh my God. Oh, Kathy, that's fantastic.
Not so ugly after all, is it?
Don't miss our discoveries from New York next time on Antiques Roadshow.
Tonight at 7 on Arizona PBS. Coming up next on Arizona PBS, Life and World.
Arizona PBS provides great musical performances all year long, and now we have some of the best seats to see your favorite acts live and in concert. Arizona PBS Box Office presents a backstage pass to meet world-class performers. Arizona PBS Box Office presents a chance to see exciting performances before they sell out. This month, Arizona PBS Box Office presents acclaimed a cappella group Straight No Chaser returns to the Valley Saturday, December 31st at Mesa Arts Center.
Support for Arizona PBS comes from viewers like you and from
Friendship Village Tempe, a retirement community for over 30 years, offers independent living with residency options, lifelong learning classes, as well as continuing care. Information at friendshipvillageaz.com.
Lights of the World International Light Festival is coming to Phoenix. Life-size dinosaur exhibit, daily acrobatic shows, and over 25 acres of light displays. November 18th through January 29th at Rawhide Wild Horse Pass. Information at Lights of the World US.
Yupa's Thai Kitchen in Tempe features fresh, authentic Thai cuisine and